What's up, everyone? Tara Roberts here with Bleacher Report. I hope that week 8 was not too brutal for you. I know that it has been continuously brutal with all of the injuries that we have been suffering, and that is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about trades that you can make to survive major fantasy injuries. This topic is definitely needed because, again, we were just hit with injury after injury after injury, and we have not only the new injuries, but the existing ones as well. Just real quickly before we dive into the players that we want to trade for, just to go over all of these injuries. It's not a 100% comprehensive list because we would literally be here all day if it was 100% comprehensive. But unfortunately, the big one that we got there, Cam Skattebo injury out for the season there. That's a big one because he had come along as a weekly top 15 option there for us at running back, and we were loving the progress that he was making. Saquon Barkley also suffered an injury. He said it was not serious. He is heading into the bye week, so hopefully he will be available once they return from the bye week. Same thing with Quinshon Judkins, injury heading into the bye week. They did say that he is day to day with a shoulder injury, so we'll need to see how that plays out. Then, of course, we have Puka Nacua that was existing there. We have Brock Bowers. We're just crossing our fingers can come back from his bye week and be finally active for us and give him just that upside that we had drafted as the overall tight end one there. Then quarterback, we had Lamar Jackson, rug pulled from underneath us. Kyler Murray dealing with the injury. Brock Purdy has been out still continuously there. Then at wide receivers, we've got guys like Nico Collins had a concussion. Drake London surprised us there with the last minute hip injury. We're going to have to know a lot more about that one and how serious it is and if it's an extended injury here, because that was the Atlanta offense did not look good without him, unfortunately. Then we had Jacoby Myers, who has been injured. Brian Thomas Jr., I was going to say BTJ there. Brian Thomas Jr., who suffered an injury before his bye week. And we've also got Calvin Ridley that's been dealing with an injury, potentially a trade candidate. Very interesting there. And then Ricky Pearsall, who we hope one day will come back here. Yeah, those are the injuries. So we've got a ton. It is just decimating fantasy rosters for the vast majority of you. I know that your roster does not look like you drafted it, unfortunately. And that does not include the guys that we lost, like Malik Neighbors and Tyreek Hill. I mean, it's just been hit after hit after hit. So let's dive in because we've got moves to make from a trade perspective in order to try and counteract all of these injuries that we've had. We're going to start off here with a running back on this list. And we have multiple running backs on this list. We're going to start off here talking about Jaylen Warren at running back. I believe that Jaylen Warren is an excellent trade target because he has been consistently undervalued this season to the point where people were rostering his RB3, not even his backup running back, at a pretty high clip there because of the general lack of belief in him as a lead back there, unfortunately. But from our perspective and looking for trade targets there, that's good for us. And especially good because he is coming off of an underwhelming fantasy performance in week 8. Now, there was nothing wrong with his fantasy performance in terms of efficiency. He had 13 carries for 62 yards. That's a nice 4.77 yards per carry clip there. Unfortunately, it did yield single-digit fantasy points, potentially definitely some frustrations there from fantasy managers. And for that reason, it does make him a very interesting buy low candidate. We know that he has significant upside in good matchups. We saw him get over 100 yards against Cincinnati. And I understand that it's easy, right, to look at that Cincinnati game and say, how maybe that was a little bit of an outlier there for him. You can see his average fantasy points per game there. He's averaging 13.6 fantasy games. That is actually extremely solid. He's being underrated here. And it's because he doesn't have that big next gear, right? And I don't know if it's him or that offense, but he's not able to get into that top 5 category. But we're talking about a guy whose worst fantasy finish, Monday Night Pending, obviously, has been RB26. That was this week right here. That's the worst performance that he has put on this year. He's been incredibly reliable as an RB2. So if you were struggling and trying to figure out what to do at running back, we need to lean in and trust Jaylen Warren to potentially buy low here, especially because for what upside he lacks on the ground, be it the, lack of production due to the offense, Aaron Rodgers loves to check down. So we know that Jaylen Warren is very capable on that end. He's been thriving from that perspective, and that receiving upside is what just always gives him that nice solid floor there. He's a clear lead back. We love Kenneth Gainwell, but at the end of the day, it is Jaylen Warren there. I'm going to go to the chat here real quick. What to do with Alvin Kamara. Unfortunately, Alvin Kamara was a buy for me, or was a sell for me last week. We needed to take advantage of him from a sell perspective. before he stepped on that field without Kendre Miller, because there was the perception that, hey, Kendre's going down, we're going to get an uptick in volume. If you can still find somebody who is desperate at running back to pawn him off, Kamara is a sell. I don't feel like it's turning around at this point. The lack of production in terms of the injury, season-ending injury, there's another one to Kendre Miller, unfortunately didn't give us an uptick in volume from Kamara. And more so than anything, because he can't find success on the ground. It's just not working in this offense, unfortunately. He's not getting the receptions that we need. We're not asking him to get the Christian McCaffrey treatment in terms of receptions, but at the very least, we need the Breece Hall treatment. We need something. We need some kind of uptick in receiving volume for him, and it just doesn't seem to be happening within the context of the Saints offense. Now they're flipping back and forth at quarterback. It's time to bail out, though technically the time to bail out was probably last week, but perhaps with all the injuries, you can find a buyer here, but yeah, he's a sell. He's a sell for a bag of peanuts. There's not a lot of upside there, unfortunately. And I hate that for him, because even if they do manage to turn things around, they've made it clear they still intend to use Taysom Hill. So we can't hope that, hey, he can, maybe get some goal line touches if the offense gets better. It's painful. From the chat also asking about Jerry Jeudy there. Jerry Jeudy, again, this one is very frustrating. I rostered Jerry Jeudy in a dynasty league. Fortunately, no redraft shares of him this year, but it's Dylan Gabriel. And Kevin Stefanski made it clear they're sticking with Dylan Gabriel. Gabriel just doesn't have the ability or the capabilities right now. Maybe he can develop into it, but right now he doesn't have the capabilities to get the ball downfield to the receivers, and they are suffering significantly. The targets are going to the tight ends. That's not going to change. That's also a function of Kevin Stefanski's offense there. So Jerry Jeudy, he's still a roster based on the fact that he is the clear wide receiver one. He does have target upside, although at some point Cedric Tillman will be back. And we do have to remember that when Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman were existing together, they were 1A, 1B, and technically speaking, Cedric Tillman was the more productive right there. So Jerry Jeudy is not someone that we can put in our starting lineup right now. I don't know if there's a market out there for him, because unfortunately everyone has the same general opinion that Dylan Gabriel is not it at quarterback for the receivers specifically, unfortunately. And if Quinshon Judkins' injury is more than just day to day, that will weaken the offense even further, unfortunately. Now, the follow-up to that question, asking if we keep David Njoku and Harold Fannin Jr. Yeah, both are good keeps. And quite frankly, interesting trade targets as well, because people seem to have a lot of skepticism towards them. And they would be very, very low value as well, just because when we're looking at, those tight ends, them both existing in that offense does make things a little bit shaky, right? From a fantasy perspective. But again, we talk about the rate that the Cleveland Browns throw to the tight ends. It makes them both very safe options to have weekly tight end one upside. So yeah, we're in keeping, holding, and even potentially buying on those Cleveland tight ends there. Moving on to our next player here, our buy here to try and overcome these fantasy injuries. It is Emeka Egbuka. I would never thought that we would be a point where I don't know if I could technically say that he is a buy low, because after you start off the season the way that he did, is it even possible to buy low? But he's definitely a buy as low as you can right now, because when we look at him, he's clearly playing through an injury. The production has been underwhelming as of recent, but he is still the same player that started off the season looking like an absolute beast. It's just tough when you're out there playing through an injury and trying to do the best for your team, who has been dealing with injuries across the board. He is the last man standing of the big three receivers there. He is the wide receiver one. Targets are showing that he is the wide receiver one. He's had 21 over the past 2 weeks. Unfortunately, of those 21 targets, he's only caught 7 of them for under 100 yards. And it's been 3 weeks since since he's last had a touchdown. So from that perspective, he's a buy low right now, especially because we have seen the clear arrival of Tez Johnson. Awesome there. Who is also a very interesting buy low option. I didn't put him on this list. Tez is not on this list. But I do believe in the production of Tez, especially as we start to get better performances from Baker Mayfield on down the line here. And at this point, Chris Godwin, who I did not talk about, unfortunately, in the injury section. Chris Godwin, we don't have any timeline on his injury. We have Bucky Irving as well. So the Tampa Bay, they're just decimated, right? And Mike Evans, who is not back, presumably at best would be back at the end of our fantasy season. So when we're looking at that offense, there's multiple buy opportunities there at wide receiver there. So Tez as well is a little buy low option there, but or buy mid option there. But Emeka Ibuka right now on the bye week is the real key there, because it's very possible that his lack of production has put fantasy managers, if they've been starting him week after week and relying on him as a wide receiver one, perhaps they're in a not so awesome spot with the underwhelming single digit fantasy point performances that he's been giving here. So if the manager in your league has a losing record and maybe can't afford to hold on to him through the bye week, now might be the perfect time for you to sneak in there and grab him. I'm going to go to the chat here real quick and then move on to our next player. Chat says Christian Watson looked good last night. Is he a high trade target on the fantasy board? He is, for sure. If he's on waivers, he's a grab, and he is a potential trade target as well. I will tell you to be careful there, because it was very encouraging to see that level of production from him right away, especially considering he tore his ACL in January. This was an aggressive timeline turnaround. Like, for perspective, Brandon Ayuk tore his ACL in October, and his practice window is going to be opened up this week, which gives him, 3 weeks and whatnot to return. So the fact that Christian Watson was able to make this level of return and perform in this way in this first game was very impressive. He's good if you need somebody right now. Long term, we do have the issue of, at some point, probably over the next month or so, we are going to get Jaden Reed back. We have seen him, and we've seen video evidence that he is there. It's not like a Joe Mixon, right? We know that Jaden Reed is there. So when we're looking at it from that perspective, like, at some point, this is going to continue to be a very muddy wide receiver core here. But in good matchups, I do think that we will have enough evidence here that Jordan Love, in good matchups that are pass friendly, they will push up the pass volume for him. And Christian Watson coming in and being that present in the offense right away, very encouraging there. We'll just, find flex option. We just don't want to over invest in him real quick. But speaking of Joe Mixon real quick, I'll talk about that one real quick here with Joe Mixon. We don't have any update, unfortunately. I've been operating as if he is not going to be with us this season. Teams typically should give some level of timeline here. And the fact that we have no timeline, it's not as if this injury happened any time close to the season. This was a persistent off-season injury, unfortunately, here. So from that perspective, you got to operate under the assumption that he's not going to be with us this year, and just move on from him, because those IR spots, if you've got them, they're piling up. He's burning a hole in your roster. You need to use them on valuable players, right? Hold him Mike Evans. Maybe he'll be back, something like that. Let me go to our next player here, and then I will jump back to the chat. Derrick Henry is our next player here. Now, obviously, we have talked about Derrick Henry quite a bit here, like 5,000 times maybe, as we've been doing these trade topics every single week. So if you're a regular viewer to this show, you have definitely heard me talk about Derrick Henry like 5,000 times, and he's very, very consistent. It's always been a buy for me, not a sell. And the reasoning is very clear here. Derrick Henry is still Derrick Henry. Look at him. Look at that Derrick Henry right there for us. That's the Derrick Henry that we know and love. There's not any concern that he is suddenly declining due to age. It's just, we know exactly who Derrick Henry is. The majority of his matchups that have been in fine matchups, his yards per carry have been perfectly fine. No issue. Looks like the same typical Derrick Henry. The problem is that his role becomes minimized when Baltimore is playing from behind. It is what it is. That's always been the case with them. So it's not an age thing. And unfortunately, the Baltimore record shows that they have been behind quite a lot this season, which puts Henry in a position where he is going to have to struggle to put up fantasy points, and it's just not going to happen. We also need to recognize that his worst fantasy performances in terms of rushing have come in difficult matchups against like Cleveland and Kansas City. Those are tough run defenses, especially if you're playing from behind there. So when you combine the struggling defense that forces Baltimore to chase points with poor ground matchups, of course, it was going to look bad for Derrick Henry. But as we saw this week in Chicago, better days are ahead. Better matchups give us the same Derrick Henry that we know and love. Baltimore's offense is not defunct. It's very fixable. And as we saw with Tyler Huntley at quarterback this week, they looked even better than they had in previous weeks with Cooper Rush there. And again, schedule is what we want to key in on here for Derrick Henry. The road ahead is very promising. We've got Miami, super run friendly. Minnesota, also surprisingly run friendly. Then we get a tough Cleveland defense, a tough, questionable defense in the Jets. But honestly, they have been very inconsistent throughout the season. They have allowed significant run volume. We just saw Chase Brown go off against them as well. Then we get Cincinnati, lovely, wonderful defense. Pittsburgh has been friendly. Cincinnati again. So really, the only concern on the schedule is like just kind of looking far, far ahead there into the fantasy playoffs is just the Week 16 matchup with New England. Outside of that, we're going to have the vast majority of these performances from Derrick Henry looking like our Derrick Henry here. So he's an excellent buy low, especially to people who might be thinking that they're selling high and trying to get out on this and not realizing that Baltimore's offense is going to turn things around. And especially because we still don't know, unfortunately, what is going on with Lamar Jackson. And hopefully Baltimore can be a little bit more transparent with us this week. But the ambiguity there does help with the value of Derrick Henry. So even though he's coming off of this strong game, do not be afraid to buy into Derrick Henry because you are still buying him well below his value. He's a clear RB1. And again, the matchups ahead are just excellent. Now chat question. What do I do with Quinshon Judkins? So we got the bye week. That is an issue. Now they did say day to day. So that's not a major concern here. For me, he is a hold because the offense is what it is. Like if we're looking at offense is moving forward. Like, let's look at a team that's on a bye. Jets are on a bye week, right? Breece Hall, obviously coming off a fantastic performance, but there's trade rumors and whatnot going on there. Maybe Isaiah Davis becomes an RB1. There's no confusion about what is going on in Cleveland. We know exactly what it is. And Quinshon Judkins is the lead back. There's no competition there for him. We wish that he would get a little bit more receiving upside, but he's showcased that even in difficult matchups, he can still push through, especially if Cleveland's defense can hold things together and keep it competitive so they don't get a game script issue there. So you got to hold with Quinshon Judkins. They claim it's day to day. At least they did let us know that. So hopefully this is not a major issue and this week gets him a little bit of extra rest and we get him back in week 10 there. Brian Thomas Jr., should I sell him? Now, this is another one that is frustrating. This is why I hate injuries that happen on teams going into the bye week because we had zero information about Brian Thomas Jr. during the bye week, and that's normal, right? That's unfortunately what happens. We're lucky if we get some kind of update from the team, but we don't get those practice reports that we utilize to really understand what we are doing in terms of, is this a long-term injury, serious injury, short-term? Like what's the deal there? So with Brian Thomas Jr., it's a hold for right now. There's a lot of panicky information going around there. They've been floating him as a potential trade candidate. I don't think that Jacksonville is going to do that. That makes no logical sense to sell a young young first round wide receiver in their second year. Just sell them off there, and you are a decently competitive-ish team with playoff aspirations there. No, so just hold. I don't think they're going to move him. I think that's just all kind of smoke screens and stuff and people wishful thinking. And again, Travis Hunter did look very good in that game being featured, but we hope for better days ahead there. We know what Brian Thomas Jr. is. So if you sell him now, you got to get actual decent value for him. Don't panic sell and sell low on him here. Chat says, should I drop Golden for Watson? Yeah, you can. And that feels reactionary, but we've had several weeks here in a sport. Of course, rookie wide receivers often, bounce back and have their breakout in the back half of the season here. But the fact that there are so many different pieces there makes it difficult for Golden. He's looked fantastic. There's no issue with him. But it's felt like we were going to have these breakout performances from him, and it just never amounts to anything other than 10 fantasy points there, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that's fine, especially because Christian Watson is more of the big play receiver there. We would like to see more volume from Golden, but unfortunately, he's also got injured. I didn't mention that one. He's also dealing with an injury as well. We don't know the details of the severity there, but yeah, it might be good to just kind of hedge your bets and move on there. I hate that. From John B on YouTube. Thank you. I appreciate that. So is Tara the GOAT. You're amazing. Coker or DK rest of season, your opinion. I'm very partial to DK, and that's Chimray DK. If anyone's not seeing, or if you can't see a comment, it's not DK Metcalf. That's very confusing for us from a fantasy perspective, because we often call DK Metcalf just DK. But Chimray DK, in the Titans offense, there, I think he has a lot of promise. I absolutely love him as a prospect. He popped all throughout the offseason at the Senior Bowl, at the Combine, showing speed. And I think a lot of times people forget he was actually drafted ahead of Alec Eiermater there. And it feels like the production shift from Alec Eiermater and then also Van Jefferson, they seem very tied to Calvin Ridley because they seem to play similar roles here. Chimray DK's role being carved out in this offense, I think can stick even when Calvin Ridley returns because they play very differently here. And we've got the benefit of Tyler Lockett exiting. And that opening up more snaps here that we saw a hefty workload here for DK. So we feel very positively about him. I love Jalen Coker a lot and the potential for what he could be. But DK popping like this, we got to lean into it here, especially with Calvin Ridley as a potential trade candidate there. Apparently everybody's a trade candidate there. Tony Pollard, Calvin Ridley, everybody. Tennessee Titans are selling. They just made a trade at cornerback. So, hey, he could be on the market and everything could just align perfectly for Chimray DK. So that's my preference there rest of season for sure. Going back to our players here that we are trading for, Jalen Waddle. We're trading for Jalen Waddle. That's our number 4 here. Now, since the injury to Tyreek Hill, Waddle has finished as wide receiver 8, wide receiver 17, and wide receiver 90. And wide receiver 4, Monday night games pending, of course, that moved back a little bit there. But don't let that wide receiver 90 fool you into thinking that Jalen Waddle is a risk or anything but a wide receiver 1. First of all, that was a brutal matchup. It was against Cleveland. Second of all, while other wide receivers have found success against Cleveland, it does not help when your quarterback says so himself that he straight up could not see past the line of scrimmage. Weather was bad. He couldn't get the ball downfield. Again, unfortunately, Tua just wasn't able to deal with the weather. And you can see that in terms of the game script for both Miami and Cleveland in that matchup. That was the week 7 matchup there where Waddle wildly underperformed and Malik Washington led the receiving corps. It was because Tua couldn't get the ball past the line of scrimmage, unfortunately. That's an outlier game. We know Jalen Waddle, and we have seen him in this offense with Tua Tagovailoa and without Tyreek Hill for an entire season. It was Waddle's rookie season, and he was a spectacular wide receiver 1 who should have ascended to, potentially a higher level, potentially like a clear wide receiver 1 level. Unfortunately, didn't happen there because of the trade for Tyreek Hill. So when we're looking at it from that perspective, feel very comfortable with Jalen Waddle as a top wide receiver, weekly borderline wide receiver 1 rest of season here that you can get at a nice little discount here. Maybe you're hesitant to trade for him off of this big performance here. Don't be hesitant. We're talking about a player who, again, has been fantastic, has showcased that he is a true wide receiver 1. And the real key here for why I love him, Miami's schedule rest of season is straight up beautiful. There are, a couple of matchups here and there that are an issue. But for the most part, the vast majority of them are very favorable, pass-friendly, or matchups where Tua is going to have to push for volume. And then they have a beautiful playoff schedule, one of the most beautiful playoff schedules I've ever seen. It is Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Tampa Bay. Those are all very pass-friendly matchups. And before you think the Steelers are, the Steelers, you remember that team last night that allowed Jordan Love to have 360 yards and 3 touchdowns on them? Yeah, they're a pass-friendly matchup. Maybe they can pull it together as the season goes on and be a stronger defense. But for the most part now, we are treating them as a little bit of a layup pass matchup there. So Waddle is one that even off of this big performance, you can invest in him and really have an excellent opportunity to have a locked in wide receiver 1 rest of season. Don't be scared of the potential firing of Mike McDaniel or a potential benching of Tua Tagovailoa. It sounds like they don't want to go that direction. And we did see a turnaround. And to be fair, they have played difficult matchups. So everything turning around for more positive matchups, we can feel a little bit more comforted with that. Gonna go to the chat here real quick. Tank, I love this. Tank, the new RB1 in Philly. Well, here's the thing. And this is very frustrating. We have another team on a bye week, which means that, again, Saquon Barkley claimed after the game that he was perfectly fine. And what you claim and what actually happens is not always the same thing. But unfortunately, we're on a bye week for him, and we're not going to get those practice reports to know how bad or good he is actually feeling there. But Tank Bigsby is still worth an ad there. And reasoning for that is that even if Saquon comes back from the bye and he is healthy and there's no issue there, we now have confirmation that Tank Bigsby is clearly the handcuff. So we're talking about a handcuff to an elite running back and an elite offense. That's something that you want on your fantasy bench. So if you've got some kind of low end, low option handcuff sitting back there, perhaps you added a Devin Neal thinking that you could capitalize on that. No, drop that, add Tank Bigsby for sure, because he would have RB1 upside if anything were to happen with this injury extending maybe for Saquon. But as of right now, it doesn't sound like that. But still worthy of a waiver wire ad. Is Worthy a sell or a hold? He is if you can do it before the game, it might be a sell. I'm concerned about this game because unfortunately it's not going to be a good litmus test again. It's going to be more than likely. I mean, maybe Washington can put up a fight, but I would expect this to be a game where Kansas City dominates. And if they dominate and it gets out of control, we may not see a lot of Xavier Worthy because he's playing through the injury there. So if you have an opportunity to sell him prior to the game, yeah. But just be aware, like after the game, it might not be the best performance from him. But yeah, he is a sell if you're able to get good value out of him because Rashee Rice is the clear wide receiver one there. Patrick Mahomes is dealing, so it's not an issue, right? But they're spreading the ball around very well. So Worthy just doesn't have that same upside, unfortunately. Going back to the list here real quick. We're going to do our we're number 5. I believe we are on number 5 here. Our number 5, yeah, there it is. We are number 5 player here. It is Jake Ferguson. And we're going to keep this one short and sweet. I am chronically online. I do a lot of shows and I read a lot of comments from fantasy managers. And I have seen more panic about Jake Ferguson from his performance yesterday than I expected. I get it. It was extremely jarring. We have never seen that type of performance from Jake Ferguson. On a week-to-week basis, he has been a top, and if not a top, like the top tight end. To go from that to scoring 0 fantasy points, that is high-key concerning, right? So I understand the panic that you are having right now if you're rostering Jake Ferguson to have 0 receptions on 1 target. That was scary, right? But don't panic. We have seen he is the locked in tight end 1 for this team. It was a weird game. I hope that we have some kind of explanation from Dallas moving forward, or maybe it was a defensive issue or whatnot. The reason people are panicked is because it wasn't just like he was eliminated from the game. We did see targets to other tight ends. Luke Schoonamaker in particular did have a touchdown catch that was called back due to a penalty there. To see that when we saw nothing to our Jake Ferguson was very frustrating there. So I completely understand conceptually why we're panicking here, but this was a weird game. But because everyone is panicking, I have seen that people do want to sell it off. So if you can buy in on Jake Ferguson, we've seen him in multiple weeks with CeeDee Lamb. This is not a CeeDee Lamb's return issue. We've seen him with CeeDee Lamb with 0 problem. I think it was just a bad matchup situation, unfortunately, here. He's shown high upside. He's a clear tight end 1 here, so don't panic. This is an excellent buy for us. I'm gonna do a chat real quick before I go back to our what will be our final player here that we want to trade for. And this is a good one. This actually ties into our next player, so this is perfect. I will segue here. Chat says, how would you value Breece Hall? So we've got 2 things. So yeah, we got another person on a bye week coming off of a fantastic game, which we know that is in part due to the matchup being against Cincinnati and their defense being objectively one of the worst I might have ever seen. But when we're looking at Breece Hall, there are 2 aspects that we need to consider. One, if he remains on the Jets, he has been very successful on the ground. It may not seem like it, right? But he's only had 2 bad performances, and they have been in bad matchups against bad matchup defenses, good run defenses there. So very understandable there. Outside of that, he's been very stable. He's successful on the ground. The only issue that we have had all season, and thank God Cincinnati opened up the doors on that one for us, Prior to this, the man had no touchdowns, and that was very frustrating. It limits the overall upside, but his success on the ground and his receiving upside made him a very stable RB2 that we could trust, getting like between 10 to 17 fantasy points there. So he is absolutely a hold for me. I don't think you have to sell high on him here because this is someone who, of all the running backs, we can't trust. Like, let's say a Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, right? We can't trust him on a weekly basis there. We think he's the RB1, but the production fluctuates there. You don't have to worry about that with Breece Hall. Now, we also have the caveat of him potentially being traded to another team here. We've had it floated around because obviously he would theoretically be the top running back on the market here. So if that happens, there are a wide variety of locations he could go to. I know the more popular one is, the LA Chargers, which would technically result in him eventually ending up in a committee with Amari and Hampton. But I kind of wonder if the Jets aren't going to make a move because their ownership has been obviously very vocal. So, and we haven't seen any action thus far here. So, Breece and the talent level that he has and the way that he's clearly bounced back, he's a hold for me right now. And moving on to our last player here before I circle back to the chat to wrap things up here. Let's talk about our last player on the buy list here. It is actually an injured player, but go with me on this. It is Garrett Wilson. We are going to buy him because he should be back after the bye week. So this is for fantasy managers that lost players on earlier in the season. They're looking for high upside here, and you can hold off one more week to wait to the return of Garrett Wilson. And this is the perfect time, again, because first of all, dealing with an injury. Second of all, and first of all, it's clear it's not a long-term injury. Second of all, we got the bye week. And then third, we've got the unknown around the quarterback situation. Who is ultimately going to be the QB1? Does Justin Fields retain the job? You would think he would retain the job after this performance, but it's the Jets. We don't trust the Jets, and we certainly don't trust Woody Johnson after the comments he made, right? So technically there is still some quarterback controversy here, and that also lowers the buy value for him as well. So we're in a nice little buy low pocket for him. But again, we don't care who's at quarterback for Garrett Wilson. It doesn't matter because his floor can be low in tough matchups. In particular, we saw 2 games against Denver and Buffalo, but outside of those 2 games, he is finished as a top 12 receiver in PPR. Translation, as long as the matchup isn't absolutely awful, Garrett Wilson remains someone that we can trust on a week-to-week basis here. So if you can just hold right now through the bye week, expect him to come back after the bye week, because again, he was not put on IR because we were told the timeline on this was not a long-term issue. It was just a little multi-week injury issue there. Holding him through the bye week makes sense in terms of his long-term health there. So we get him back. He's been successful with both Garrett Wilson and Tyrod Taylor there. So we trust at this point Garrett Wilson and his fantasy upside in PPR for sure. And quite frankly, overall, but you can't ask for a better buy low option for somebody whose perception is super down, but has the ability to put up extremely high numbers because he is the only wide receiver option in that offense. He has no competition. It doesn't exist. But that wraps things up, guys. I'm going to recap the list here for you real quick. We talked about Jaylen Warren as a very solid RB2 that you can buy low coming off an underwhelming performance, but has clearly dominated his backfield and been the lead back and successful and very reliable in terms of never having a absolute bust week. Then we have Emeka Egbuka, who has been underperforming for the past several weeks here, but we know his ceiling is extremely high. He is also on a bye week here, so that does add in the caveat of maybe you can weasel him out of the fantasy manager that potentially needs another option this week. Derrick Henry, whose rest of season schedule is turning around real quick here soon, and we got a nice little preview against Chicago of this is what we expect from Derrick Henry in good matchups there. We also talked about Jalen Waddle, who is coming off of a great performance. So this is not a buy low candidate. It's a buy perception candidate of people not, truly understanding the ultimate value that he offers from a fantasy perspective as a true wide receiver 1 there. And we talked about Jake Ferguson off of the shockingly low day, 0 fantasy points there, but he's Jake Ferguson. This is an anomaly game, possibly a little matchup indicative. Dak had a very struggling game compared to what we typically expect out of him. Jake Ferguson has been fine with CeeDee Lamb. That was not the issue here. So we trust him as a tight end one. This is a good opportunity because I've seen a lot of panicky comments around Jake Ferguson's production there. And then our last player there was Garrett Wilson. We are buying him on the injury here. I know it is a little bit risky, but the upside is worth it because he has finished multiple times as a top 12 receiver. He has no competition in his receiving core. He is guaranteed a certain level of volume, and he has found success no matter who is at quarterback here. He has proven it time and time again here. So if you need and you can hold out past this bye week and invest in the long-term upside for Garrett Wilson, it is absolutely there for us. But that wraps things up. I appreciate you all tuning in. Again, make sure that you got your alerts on because the injuries and the news, they just keep coming. And I will be here with you every week, remainder of the season here to help you win your league. You can also find me across all social media platforms at It's Steer Time. Again, have a fantastic week. Enjoy this Monday night game here. Good luck with your lineups, and I will talk to you again next week.